Hello, everyone who has joined so far. I can see a few familiar names in the attendees list. So hello, everyone I know, and hello, everyone I don't know as well. I'm really excited to be doing this today. It's a great opportunity to talk with a great writer about the Middle East and someone who I've worked with for quite a long time now. Margaret Coker, who is based out in Georgia currently, but has spent much of the last 2 decades, is that right, in Iraq and the broader Middle East. We're going to be talking about her book, The Spymaster of Baghdad. The writing's all backwards, but it's in the blurb for the event, which was published by Penguin Viking in the UK and HarperCollins in the US. And yeah, I thought that we could just have a general chat about the book itself, and then have as much time as possible for discussion. But to give you a bit of background on Margaret, she's a journalist who's written extensively about Iraq in particular, but conflict and politics in the Middle East over much of the last couple of decades. Was the New York Times's Iraq correspondent. I first met her when she was working at the Wall Street Journal, and her expertise in this area is really like very, very formidable. So it's really exciting to be able to have this conversation about a book which I've was reading it just last week, and it took me very little time to read because it is a really interesting and different take on a war that I spent most of the last decade myself looking at. So I really, really recommend taking a look at it yourselves. But I should turn the mic, oh, not mic, the Zoom over to you, to Margaret, to talk perhaps a bit about the framing of the book and your experience researching it and then ultimately putting it together.
Thank you for having me, Charlie, and thank you all for the generosity of your interest and your hour today as we talk about Spymaster of Baghdad. I appreciate Charlie's kudos to my alleged formidability when it comes to all things Middle East. But in fact, I actually am sort of an accidental Middle East person. I grew up here in the U.S. and, you know, a part of a Cold War military family. That's the family profession. All the men have served as officers in the near abroad. But, you know, we grew up watching World War II movies, and I was always fascinated with John le Carré and everything that I could read about the Cold War. And I went on to study Russian, as a matter of fact, Russian and international affairs. So I pivoted to the Middle East in large part because of this little event that changed many of our lives called the September 11th attacks. And the newspaper I was working for at the time sent me from Moscow to Afghanistan, which is where I stayed for pretty much the year plus after the September 11th attacks. And then went to the Middle East at the beginning of 2003. Started studying Arabic there and was in and out of Iraq since the US invasion in the spring. Gosh, that would have been 18 years ago now. My goodness, yeah, so almost 2 decades. So yeah, after a while, I figured that I needed to start rebranding myself away from a Soviet studies person and as a Middle Eastern person, just because of this never-ending war on terror meant that there was always newspaper work to be done in the Middle East. I went to work for the Wall Street Journal. I lived in the Gulf. You know, went back and forth between Baghdad, Dubai and Saudi Arabia and Yemen for much of my time living there. I covered all of the Arab Spring revolutions, but I kept coming back to Iraq in large part because that's, of course, where the Americans were for a good part of the last 15 years or so. And, you know, I, as a journalist, was trying to tell stories that no one else was telling, but back home in America, most of the stories being told about Iraq and, you know, the narrative about Iraqi history post-Saddam was always being told through the eyes of the US military and or US bureaucrats or US journalists talking about those people. And all of those stories, of course, are fascinating and all of them are valid. I just thought, it's about time that the Iraqis became central characters again in their modern history. And in fact, as those of us who've been in and out of Baghdad or Najaf or Mosul or Basra over the last 15 years know, there are legions of Iraqis who suit up every day in defense of their nation, trying to make it a better place. And we just haven't heard their stories yet. So fast forward very quickly to 2014, which is probably when I started to get to know Charlie fairly well because of that whole thing known as the Islamic State, when the juggernaut that it was took over a third of the nation of Iraq and redrew the maps of the Middle East, redrew the networks of jihadology, I think is what we might call it. I was an investigative reporter, and so I took it upon myself to learn more about the ways in which it was acting as a proto-state, the ways in which Iraq and its institutions had crumbled even more. But academically speaking, I'm someone who's on the pointy end of the stick in terms of doing that first draft of history. But academically, because of my background in the Soviet Union, I have always been incredibly interested in the ways in which authoritarian single-party states can transform or don't transform away from those sort of superstructures and infrastructures when they have a regime change. And so I was always fascinated in the way in which Iraq was trying to develop post-Saddam and comparing that to other Arab nations. Meanwhile, we have a large ground offensive, right? The largest urban warfare battles that were being fought since World War II in some people's estimations because of the Iraqi response to the Islamic State blitzkrieg. I went back to Iraq full time then with the New York Times in the summer of 2017, and I was incredibly struck by just this sea change in Baghdad specifically between 2014 and 2017. In 2014, there were emergency evacuation orders for embassies. People were talking about Baghdad being sacked like the Mongol hordes of the early Middle Ages. And then in 2017, despite the green zone, Iraqis themselves, Baghdadis themselves, they were out on the streets. There was a renaissance in the town. They were safe. Families were out at night eating ice cream and playing football. Small businesses had reinvested and reopened. There were nightclubs. There was liquor for sale, and all of this was happening at a time when, people in the West were talking about the potential end of Western culture as we knew it, because Islamic State was such a driving force in the online world and definitely in the propaganda world. But someone had cracked the nut about how to make Baghdad safe. It had gone from being the murder capital of the world in the mid-2000s to a place where people wanted to be outside again with their families. And so I started this journalistic quest, a very simple question, which was, who was able to make Baghdad safe and how? Because the Americans sure didn't do it, and the coalition certainly hadn't been able to do it. And here we are in this new reality. So thus begins the nugget of what became a front page New York Times story and then my eventual book. Because as I was going around the various security agencies, whether it was the US-led coalition and American generals, or the various Iraqi security agencies, militias, military, or interior forces, trying to find out who was responsible for safety in Baghdad, a lot of doors slammed in my face. A lot of people didn't know. A lot of people didn't actually realize exactly what an amazing feat this was. But then slowly people started pointing me in the direction of the spymaster of my title, a man named Abu Ali al-Basri, who, as his nom de guerre tells you, originally comes from Basra. He had been one of these men who, since 2005 in his case, had joined up as a middle manager in the prime ministry in Iraq under the former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, and had risen through the security ranks to build up this formidable, little known top-notch intelligence agency that is known as the Falcons. And when Abu Ali al-Basri finally deigned to meet with me, and we had a meeting of the minds. He had decided he wanted to tell this amazing story of wartime espionage with his undercover officer that he had placed inside the Islamic State ranks. He decided to break classification to allow me to be the journalistic vessel to tell this story, in large part because of the sacrifice of this officer. And he wanted recognition for his officer. He wanted to help the family left behind, but he also, as a canny political operator who survived the corridors of backbiting and backstabbing power of Baghdad, knew that a little bit of recognition wouldn't go amiss when other Iraqi forces were getting lots of attention for their own battlefield successes in the battle against Islamic State. So, right place, right time, right questions. I ended up with the ear of the Spymaster, and we ended up writing this book with his consent and with his support. I had enormous amount of access to documents that to my mind, at least in English, haven't seen the light of day. During my book research, the official history written and published by the U.S. Army, the official history of the Iraq War came out, and like we all have seen in English publications, it was an incredibly one-sided tale. There's always talk of these unnamed sort of mythical partners that the U.S. and coalition forces have used in their battles in the war on terror, and so my book sort of recalibrates that history. I give them names. I give us all the backstory. I give them. I've had lots of interesting and I think exclusive access to a lot of Iraqi documents, both National Security Council meetings that have never been published. I had access to the Falcons' own interrogation files. I had access to court documents in the terror courts that usually aren't published and unavailable. And I had access to these individuals. So it was a incredibly exhilarating kind of research project, because there was a lot of information that hasn't been out in the public domain yet. But really, I wrote this book, I mean, as a way that I hope that people who know the Middle East much better than I do, you'd actually be able to learn something, and you'd have a new layer of Iraqi history. But I wanted to remind Americans and Brits as well, this event that happened in our recent history so long ago, is still quite important, and there's still a lot to learn. So as a newspaper person, we like to think of ourselves as writing the first drafts of history. And this being my first book, I hope I contribute to the second draft of modern Iraqi history, and tell in a little bit more detail just what the culture, the people and families are like, as well as what counterterrorism looks like these days in Baghdad.
Great, thank you so much for that that description of the process. I think you mentioned it briefly at the end, but that it is a very personally told story of the recent iteration of the war in Iraq against the Islamic State, but also you go much further back than just 2014, even though that seems like an eternity away in this strange pandemic world that we're in. But I personally really appreciated that, because it kind of was a really absorbing way to get into something that was focusing on the CT counterterrorism aspect of things. I mean, it's basically not often that you read a book about counterterrorism or intelligence that's non-fiction and is something that you can read quickly and enjoy and feel like you're getting to know the characters in it. So I think we can turn to questions in a bit. I'm going to abuse my right as moderator or chair or whatever I am, and ask the first question. But if I could ask anyone in the attendees, the audience, to raise their hand. I think there's there's a little hand emoji that you can click, and then hopefully I'll be able to see that hand being raised. And I'll also have my eyes on the little Q&A box. But as I said, I'm going to ask the first question, and then we'll see where we go next. One of the recurring themes of the kind of hunt for leaders in whether it was AQI or ISI or ISIS, or more latterly the Islamic State, is the fact that they, at the kind of upper echelons, they really try not to spend too much time on the internet, relying on human couriers and trying to keep secure by just essentially very close, tight circles of trust. So that came up on a few occasions with Abu Ali's work, trying to track people down, identifying the courier, and then from there identifying the location of the leaders in question. I thought that was a really interesting juxtaposition with what we know about the Islamic State from a media perspective, because there's as in its own propaganda perspective, it's a group that it kind of made its name by producing propaganda, much of which was published online. So I found that an interesting juxtaposition within it as an organization. But more broadly, I'm just really fascinated by this courier-based tracking of individuals. So I just wondered whether you could maybe talk a little bit more about that in your own words and not as clumsily as I have, and just explain how fundamental that was to the kind of intelligence picture for the Falcons over the last decade or so.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how many people that are listening in have actually had a chance to read the book. So I don't want to give too much away. But having said that, we have three main characters who are the quote unquote good guys. And we have a fourth character who is the quote unquote bad woman, a villain who is now a convicted terrorist. And so, I had the the honor and the pleasure of listening to the Falcons give me their greatest hits, right? I mean, it wasn't just Abu Ali al-Basri that I talked to. I had a lot of access to the interrogators, their tactical teams, and so they also gave me access to their files in a lot of cases when they couldn't remember details, or when I thought that they were telling me, tall tales. I wanted to double check on facts. But within the start of the book process, as a narrative storyteller, I was trying to figure out, which of the operations I could pack into a book without it being overloaded, and so figuring out which ones would be able to illuminate different aspects of the intelligence strategies and campaigns that they were successful in was part of my overall aim. And so there is, since 9/11, I think we probably all know, in the Anglo world specifically, there's been this huge over-reliance on big tech and electronic surveillance. The old-fashioned, old-school intelligence gathering of human sources and human intelligence went by the wayside in this need to have metrics, need to have lots of reliability after we were all surprised and shocked and dismayed about 9/11. So the identification of who's an enemy has been obviously the driving force of a billion-dollar private industry, as well as government agencies over the last 15 years. And the value that the Falcons brought to the table in the Iraqi-centric part of the war on terror has really just been, Abu Ali's keeping of the files. He knows the networks of people in and out because that's what he does so well. It's also what the Western intelligence agencies have no idea about, because let's face it, above and beyond, British tabloid journalism screaming about foreign fighters going to fight the jihad, the vast majority of the foot soldiers and leadership of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have been Iraqis and Syrians or Saudis or Jordanians. And so people from those countries obviously are going to understand the cultural significance of individuals' family ties, tribal ties, and social networks. And so partnering up big tech, high-tech surveillance systems that the international coalition brought to Iraq, and the ground game of the details of the files is why this partnership between the Falcons and the US specifically has worked so well since the mid-2000s. And some of their early successes that brought Abu Ali into the confidence to the US was just his ability to deliver not only names but tracking then the couriers who led the Western coalition to AQI's leadership in Iraq back in, gosh, Charlie, you can remind me, 2007 was it?
AQI 2000.
AQI.
Oh, AQI. So
7 or 8.
Zarqawi was 6, but
yeah. So post Zarqawi.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time with middle-aged Iraqi intelligence officers smoking cigarettes and shisha in grubby little cafes in Baghdad as they relived their glory days of tracking down the couriers and tracking down the men who led them to the couriers. And it's all very fascinating stuff. And it's, there are hours and hours of transcripts that I have of these interviews where the names won't mean anything to anybody except for intelligence professionals or jihadi specialists. So there's a knack to storytelling that I hope I've hit in the book, whereby you get the process of what the Falcons were good at without bogging down a general reader with too many unfamiliar and unpronounceable names. But the fact remains that Abu Ali al-Basri, he is an unlikely spy. He also is, sort of from a personality and a physical specimen. He's someone that is the closest thing to an Arab George Smiley that I've ever met. He is a man who literally wears gray suits, a man who sits in the corner, who doesn't emote and has no ego, which is a rare thing in an Iraqi, an Iraqi meeting of political power players. Iraqis among many Arabs are known for their hot blood because they fly off the handle quite quickly. Abu Ali is not that person. He's the man who keeps information close, and when he talks, people listen because he does it so rarely. So in a cluttered office full of files of names and networks, he was a go-to guy through the late 2000s. And as AQI was being rolled up and demolished, it's men like him and his unit that was very responsible, just because they did the plotting basic work of intelligence.
I mean, he does just, he sounds like a really amazing guy. I know I won't ever meet him, but I really want to. And yeah, your description of him as a George Smiley figure definitely comes across in the book. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I will read them out, and then you can respond to them. So we actually heard quite a lot more detail about what Abu Ali and the Falcons did. This question from Rachel Briggs is, can you tell us more about what the Spymaster and his colleagues did, and what was it about them that made them successful? I wonder if I can, to avoid you repeating yourself, I wonder if I can ask you about a specific aspect of the Falcons' work, or maybe in comparison to other aspects of Iraq's intelligence apparatus. I'm really interested by the I forget what his first name is, but the Shahwani figure, who was the head of a different part of Iraq's intelligence apparatus that was very problematic for a great many reasons. And I wonder if you could talk about the Falcons through the lens of that kind of opposition and that internal conflict within the Iraqi intelligence community.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, at least on US bookshelves, there are tomes and tomes of written by ex-generals and retired colonels about how the US military stood up the new Iraqi army and armed forces. And so little has been told about the rebuilding of the intelligence services. Again, I hope that my book tries to fill this hole in at least a small part, because, before Saddam fell, it was a terrible place to live. It was a country run by secret police. Iraqis refer to it as the Republic of Fear. I mean, just like Eastern Germany, or just like Romania, or just like Russia under the KGB. It was a fearful place, and overlapping intelligence agencies existed, not to keep anyone in the country safe, except for the ruler and his family. And so untangling this morass and transforming a secret police state into something that resembles something else, that was Iraq's great promise, really, I mean, among Arab states. And it was in a much larger, I think, umbrella of transformation. It was the first, Arab Spring. It obviously happened under extremely different and bloody circumstances, but reestablishing Iraqis' perception of authority and citizens' relationship to power and authority was one of the aims of the, I think maybe the naive but hopeful original political class of exiles who came back home. Abu Ali al-Basri, found himself within that circle. He was a person like so many Iraqi Shias. He and his family were victims of Saddam's repression. His father was disappeared. His wife's family, her father and her two sisters and brother and uncle were all disappeared and raped, tortured, and killed in Saddam's secret prisons. Abu Ali al-Basri had to flee, and so, like so many other people, just to stay alive. And so while he was in exile through the 80s and all of these sort of ground, lesser known guerrilla wars that the CIA helped fight against Saddam, and the Iraqi exiles were fighting with the Iranians against Saddam. Abu Ali al-Basri was part of a political apparatus that was trying to stay one step ahead of Saddam's killers, who went abroad as foreign intelligence officers to try and find political opposition and kill them. So he came to spying in a roundabout way, but counterintelligence is about staying ahead of your enemies and knowing what your enemies are doing. So when there's a chance to rebuild the state after 2003, he becomes a small part of a larger governmental juggernaut. And like all of our own nations, of course, interagency rivalries are real. They are the things that muck up the wheels of bureaucracy as much as anything else. And Abu Ali al-Basri found himself with a very formidable rival. The US spent $1 billion a year for the first 5 years of after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein to rebuild the National Intelligence Agency in Iraq. And guess what? The Americans did it as a replication of the CIA. And they chose a man to lead this new national intelligence apparatus who was an old CIA hand, CIA agent, an Iraqi who they knew and trusted. He also happened to share their worldview, which at the time, back in 2003, was when the White House considered there to be an axis of evil that included Iran and Syria and North Korea. And so Iran watching became the priority for the new National Intelligence Agency in Baghdad. And that is something that the Americans wanted, and certain elements in Iraq wanted as well. But that didn't help them actually fight the real and present al-Qaeda threat on the ground, and the Sunni extremist threat that wasn't yet al-Qaeda, but went through many different iterations. And so Abu Ali al-Basri became a person that caught the Americans' attention, in part because of the failure of his rivals after the Samara shrine bombing, after the United Nations headquarters bombing, when nobody had any answers and Abu Ali could bring files and names and networks to the Americans, they realized maybe we need to switch horses here. Maybe we need to find another strategic partner in this fight against terrorism and jihadi networks.
Sorry, I was
are.
on mute. My daughter's running around in the background, so thought I'd spare you all that. Moving quite nicely from that question in your response, there's been a couple of questions. I'll get to people who want to ask them live in a moment. I can see one from you, Jason. But there's a couple of questions that relate to how the Falcons interacted with other security forces. So obviously there's the Americans, but the other elephant in the room is Iran and the Iranian intelligence and security presence inside Iraq. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and especially as it relates or as it kind of changed with Abu Ali's relationship with Nouri al-Maliki, and obviously that's a whole separate story that you probably won't have a chance to get into. But yeah, if you could talk about Iran and where the Falcons or how the Falcons interacted or didn't interact with Iran, that would be perfect.
Yeah, so you know, the Iraqi political space is full of patrons and super patrons, and you know, the Dawa party of Nouri al-Maliki has obvious and clear historic ties with Iran, financial ties with Iran. But to the best of my knowledge, the Iranians have not and do not fund the Falcons as an elite counterterrorism unit. Institutionally, the Falcons have always existed under the Interior Ministry, not the armed forces, but in the Iraqi Interior Ministry. Like so many Iraqi Interior Ministries, there's a multitude of specialities and responsibilities that takes on. Nouri al-Maliki created, helped basically to stand up the Falcons as an agency under his direct command, in part because the National Intelligence Service was being funded by the Americans and thus was taking orders and their strategic priorities were being set by the Americans more than Baghdad. And that made Maliki furious, and there's a whole nother book that could be written about those rivalries again. But the funding from Maliki's office came straight from the Iraqi parliament, and Maliki had many slush funds. He didn't really have to go to Tehran looking for money. He was the man in power, so he got to put his hands in whatever kitties he wanted to, which is a problem for Iraq, but was never a problem for the Falcons. When it comes to strategic partnerships, Abu Ali has been very clear that his job, or the major priority of the Falcons has always been to go after high value targets that are Sunni jihadis and uncovering those networks. Now, later on, after the US coalition forces left in 2010 and 2011, there was another very strategic threat that the Falcons branched out into as they were keeping tabs on this nascent and then burgeoning ISIS and then IS threat. They're also taking up a very critical role internally, domestically, in identifying domestic organized crime within Iraq. And some of those crime networks are very much focused on Shia militias, some with very, very forward and direct funding from Iran. And so trying to get a handle on them and taking down some of them also became part of his MO. So he doesn't have Abu Ali al-Basri and the Falcons don't have a whole lot of friends when it comes to the very the very ideological Shia militia power centers in Iraq, because he's been fighting the battles on two different ends. And I think probably his counterterrorism battles have been more successful than the organized crime Shia militia battles, quite frankly.
Oh, there I go. Sorry, talking on mute again. I was just saying, yeah, so you didn't miss anything. I'm going to come to Jason now, who I think I can allow to talk. Zoom tells me that I can. So Jason, if you have a question, I'm allowing you to talk now.
Hi, Meg and Charlie. One, great to see you both. And two, I think this field of not only intelligence history in the kind of Christopher Andrew way, but how Arab states use intelligence internally and in the war on terror is one of the rather large lacuna in the Middle Eastern studies field. So I understand that your book is not about what I'm about to ask, Meg, but I'd just love to have your 2 cents and thoughts on a comparative question, which is, it is widely acknowledged that Arab nationalist states had intelligence apparatuses which were very strong and very close to policymakers, right? And this was true under Gaddafi and Hafez al-Assad and Saddam. In these post-regime change situations, of which Egypt is not really one, but certainly Tunisia, Libya, and Iraq are post-regime change situations, how would you say that the role of the intelligence agencies and institutions is different in these post-regime change countries? And comparatively, what could it be in a more helpful way for those societies, rather than just as us Westerners who are interested in our own counter-terror and kind of utilize these people? How can they use it better for their own domestic needs? Thank you.
Oh, wow. I will limit myself to maybe a few minutes, like a couple of minutes, trying to answer this incredibly complicated and important question. Again, I came to the Middle East with this Soviet studies background. And, when 2003, the beginning of the 21st century, we all of us who were looking at the transitioning former Soviet states and Eastern Europe sort of saw, where the backlash was coming from, and the backlashes in terms of transitioning to any sort of forget free market, but sort of open and transparent democracy. It was coming from the intelligence and secret services, right? I mean, the KGB is the KGB is the KGB, and when those security agencies, and no matter what part of the world you're looking at, when officers of those agencies have a repressive use of power, as well as a financial advantage in the marketplace, I mean, those two things are as weapons to use against citizenry and reform are huge. There's a very simple case to be made as why Egypt is not part of, the Arab Spring was so brutally and finally crushed. It's because the Interior Ministry that employs more than 1 million people in Egypt never, ever, ever bought into the reforms, and everything that was being done both externally from our governments and others to make it reform has never happened. So again, Iraq, there was an arc of promise in terms of the entire system of government broke down and was destroyed in a very bloody way with incredibly high casualties. Obviously, I'm not trying to underestimate how terrible the US invasion really was. But if you're going to rise from those ashes, there's a chance to remake things, not in the image that the bureaucratic realities would like or could even dictate. And so, for sure, when you grow up in a repressive society, when you grow up with a repressive bureaucracy, outside reform is nearly impossible, and unless there's a public demand and a public will to make it happen. I think for many years in Iraq, the best you could say was that there was such chaos in the government ranks that when you have competing agencies with security privileges and obligations and budgets, you can sometimes have a positive outcome rather than a fatalistic one, which is more repression and more torture. That's one of the reasons why I was drawn to the story about the Falcons, because for all of the bad and horrible news that comes out of Iraq, here was a small slice of professionals who were actually trying to do something good, not because they were getting paid by the Americans to do something good, but because they actually believed that they should be able to change the way that intelligence is gathered and intelligence agencies work, and people's relationship to power, citizens' relationship to power should be more transparent and based on decency and respect rather than torture. So it's not a Pollyanna view about the way in which security forces work in the Middle East or anywhere in the world for that matter. But it is, I think, a compelling story in the sense that Abu Ali al-Basri was able to actually get results by doing things the way that we all can agree were the right way to do it, which is using basic psychological tools that are positive and have use affirmative logic rather than repressive ones in order to get what you want. And this isn't a Western value that I'm imposing on Iraq. This is something that an Iraqi intelligence professional saw was good because it brought him good outcomes and it made his nation safer.
And just on that point, because there's been a couple of questions actually about the Falcons' approach to detention and interrogation, and there's a couple of bits in the book that kind of specifically and very directly address that issue of getting results not through inflicting pain and human rights abuses on people. So I think there's definitely more to read about that in the book itself. And I mean, so I think probably we'll move on to a different question. Just looking at time, actually, I was going to ask you if you could go into it in a bit more detail, but I think just in the interest of time, we should move to the next question. This is an interesting one about the nature of the documents that you're working with. They were official files and official written records prepared by the Falcons. Did you find yourself having to read them with a very critical eye to look for a specific reading of events that may have been the wording here is self-serving, but that sounds very harsh, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. How did I verify
I think yeah, exactly. It's a good question.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a much better way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, very bluntly, I have a lot of respect for the Falcons, and I didn't believe what they told me until I could go out and verify them. And having a variety of sources because of my access in Iraq allowed me to do that. There's so many things that I left out of the book because I just couldn't independently verify what I was being told. So, you know, I found that going to Americans and British officials was almost useless for verifying anything except for very, very high value operations, because quite frankly, the Americans and the British had a very hard time like understanding who was in rooms during national security discussions. And I had, in terms of written files, I had former prime ministers, former national security advisors, all gave me a great deal of time in terms of research, and they opened their files to me as well. So, you know, I had lots and lots of documents in Arabic that were meeting minutes of National Security Council meetings and other Security Command meetings as well, that I could use to cross-reference names, cross-reference events, cross-reference dates. Of course, you know, and the Falcon Zone files, you know, they're very terse, you know, in terms of narrative storytelling. You really do need to draw people out in order to tell a lot of details. And one-on-one in the smoky cafes was when you can get men to talk about their missions in a way that isn't bureaucratese. So when they told me about their missions, I would then go find the plot points on a map and make sure that, you know, a building was where they remembered it was. I would go and verify, you know, as far as I could, arrest records and court records of people that had been captured or were targets of drone operations. And so when we move up into the Islamic State and the undercover operations of Harith al-Sudani, you know, getting to his safe houses, understanding where they were, looking at contemporaneous events in Baghdad, where I was and had been for many of those the points of his of that operation. You know, there's a lot of different journalistic tools you can bring to verify events. What I had a harder time doing, you know, in terms of the dialogue and the I think the personal reminiscences of Harith Sudani's family and friends. You know, I did not have access to Harith Sudani. You know, he's a major figure in the book, and I never met him. And so I was reliant on secondhand sources throughout to tell his side of things. And so from that point of view, I was dependent more on files and more on secondhand sourcing than I would generally feel comfortable with as a journalist. But for many of the actual newsworthy events in terms of operations, I had a variety of different ways to cross-reference and verify facts.
Great, I think that's a great answer to that question. And yeah, it's an unenviable position to be in. But an interesting one, certainly an interesting one.
Well, and then the other wrinkle, let me just add, you know, again, I have no interest. I'd like to, I think that the Falcons are worthy of our understanding and our reading, but I really am not, you know, a paid shill for them. You know, I think that one of the I think endearing and captivating things about the book is that they made some pretty bad mistakes, and I have included those as well. They're not all-seeing, all-knowing, and all-powerful, but as well, I didn't want to get anyone else killed, and so there's many things, you know, in terms of sources and methods. No one had any approval over what I wrote, but I did negotiate with Abu Ali al-Basri some of the contours of what was permissible to publish in terms of not endangering some of his agents that are still in the field, for example, and making sure that his sources and agents would remain safe. Just, you know, so I've told what I could, and I've written about what I could verify. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left. I think there's a bit of time for 2 or 3 questions. And if anyone has any that they'd like to ask, then I'm very happy to allow people to talk. But also the Q&A box works too. I quite like letting people talk. It's gives me a power trip. Anyway, there's a great question from Paul Evans here. I'll just read it out. I wonder if you encountered any aspects of intelligence tradecraft that seemed unique to the Iraqi context. So yeah, I'll just leave that hanging there.
Wow, I don't know that they would say that they have any unique skill set other than obviously, you know, have home field advantage, I think. You know, they're as Iraqis, they know the players, and they know the tribes, and they know the intermarriages, and they know, you know, that in and of itself is key. I don't think that you can drop a Jordanian intelligence officer into Iraq and expect the same results as you could from an Iraqi who's dedicated to the same task. But in terms of actual tradecraft, no, I mean, you know, there's a lot of different ways in which during the Cold War, you know, there's personal motivations for becoming a double agent. You know, you come in from the cold, or you decide to betray your country for reasons that are intensely personal, and you know, having that psychological insight into why someone would be so brazen or to be so desperate is you know, much different if you're talking about, you know, if you're talking about Berlin in the 70s, or you know, Moscow in the 80s versus Baghdad, or Tarimiyya or Mosul, you know, in the 2000s. But knowing these, you know, these psychological details of the Iraqi male mind is something that the Falcons understand incredibly well. And part of Abu Ali al-Basri's recruitment to his band of brothers was, you know, there's a couple of guys who are obviously there because they're great shots and they're muscle, but basically he's got a lot of emotionally mature men who are able to compartmentalize their selves versus their work selves, and who don't mind spending a whole lot of time trolling Telegram and Signal, but then also can walk into a room with a certain amount of authority that's not overpowering, but still can bend people psychologically to their will, because they have those mental pressure points that of knowing who your family is, who's in jail, what your mother will say if you get her on the phone. And it's pretty fantastic. I mean, there's a passage in the book about actually getting a jihadi's mother on the phone, and that gets him to turn. So
yeah,
old school stuff.
Yeah. There's lots of I mean, as you've been talking, there's all sorts of episodes in the book that I keep wanting to bring up, but I'm too much of a nerd for this kind of thing, and probably what's really interesting to me, like Abu Nabil. I love the cameo of Abu Nabil in Abra's experience, which I
not
won't
just a cameo. He seems to have been like the main radicalizer, actually.
More so, no, more just it wasn't a name that I was expecting to see, and this is Abu Nabil, who was a very senior leader in the Islamic State, and then who ended up over in Libya as the kind of head of the Islamic State's provinces there, and he plays a prominent role, as you say, in the radicalization and eventual kind of, well, I don't want to do any spoilers, but in the radicalization of Abra, one of the individuals whose path is followed in the book.
And we haven't talked about her at all. So if you want to ask your female radicalization question, now's the time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's do it. So Abra, I found the story of her really interesting from lots of different angles. So she is a young woman who is a scientist and has skills that are she considers would be useful to the Islamic State. Did you? I mean, I've got actually tons of questions about her, but I think this one will give you an opportunity to go in a few different directions. When you were going through these files, were you particularly taken in by her story as opposed to someone else that was in the files? What was it about her that you thought was made her an ideal person to follow in parallel with the Sudanis and Abu Ali?
Yeah, so when I was searching, you know, the greatest hits list of the Falcons to figure out, you know, how you can plot plot out some of these into a book and highlight different parts of their skill set through their operations, I was struck by the fact that there was, excuse me, a foiled biological terror attack in Baghdad. That's something that no one had ever talked about before. So from a pure sort of news value, I thought that was pretty extraordinary. But then when the Falcons told me that the person, the lone wolf responsible for this foiled terror attack was a woman, I thought, okay, well, you know, your journalistic instinct kicks into gear, because we can all see how unusual and sexy, quote unquote, that might be as a news story. But when I talked to her interrogators more and more, I was actually struck by the fact that they were very, they were incredibly sympathetic and empathetic towards her. They did not, they never referred to her or talk about her as a villain. They were actually incredibly paternalistic and quite sad about all of her potential being wasted. And so I thought, well, if these interrogators can feel this way about her, I think that readers might be able to understand a bit more about what actually happens through the process of radicalization, and what can bring a promising young woman with everything on paper, had her whole life ahead of her, down this terrible wormhole. And so those are the major reasons why I decided to include her. And then it took months and months and months to find her family, because there was no directory assistance in Baghdad. They had, once their daughter was arrested and then put on trial for terrorism charges, they were completely shunned in their Sunni neighborhood in Baghdad. They had to move away because of the shame and the ostracization that happens in Iraq when you're associated with a terrorist mastermind. And so finding them took ages and weeks and months. And when we finally found them and they agreed to tell me their side of the story, it felt again like you could verify all the facts, and you could tell a very human-driven story about someone whose life ended up so terribly.
Yeah, and it is so fascinating that the experience of traveling in a rather roundabout fashion over to Syria, and then I thought that the dissonance between what she was expecting and what she got when she got there, and it's not the usual dissonance that you always hear people talking about when they're talking about foreign fighters going to join ISIS or the Islamic State.
It's pretty fascinating. You know, Abrar, you know, this isn't, it shows somehow again that everything doesn't narrow down neatly into sectarian differences in Iraq. You know, Abrar came from an upper middle class Sunni family with a Shia mother who taught Islamic studies in her own elementary school. So she's not someone that was, you know, steeped in hatred or fundamentalism at all. But she still fell down the radical wormhole. But her expectations as an upper class Baghdadi woman who was able to get higher degrees, to work outside the house, and had a pretty free lifestyle when it comes to many Arab realities. You know, she actually didn't understand what the Islamic State was about in terms of how she would be pigeonholed when she arrived there. And it was this great sort of naivete and entitlement, I think, as a Baghdadi instead of a country girl that you know ended up getting her in a lot of trouble. Yeah,
really, really fascinating. I wonder if I could ask you for one last question, because there's one more in the Q&A. Mike Fleet has been waiting very patiently, and half an hour in fact, and I just asked another question, so it'd be terrible of me if I didn't ask it. And it's a good question to end on as well. Essentially, it is about the Falcons. What in your opinion, based on your knowledge of the Falcons and Abu Ali and Iraq today. What do you think the future is of Abu Ali and his colleagues? What are they up to?
Well, I have stayed in touch. The book has been waiting for publication for a year now because of COVID delays. But in the last year, I have stayed in close contact with all of these fine fellows. And Abu Ali, just in the last six weeks, excuse me, he's finally fell victim to interagency rivalries in Iraq. Oh. The current prime minister is his former rival at the National Intelligence Service. And there was a head chopping of many people at the Interior Ministry, Abu Ali being one of them. So the Falcons have now been reassigned under the armed forces instead of the Interior Ministry. Abu Ali has been put into a kind of a meaningless desk job. And much of this has to do with personal rivalries rather than professional capabilities. So we're probably going to have to wait to the next election cycle in Iraq to see if Abu Ali can come back in his professional capacity in some way, because the two men really just don't get along. In terms of the Sudanis, the younger brother, Munaf Sudani, after the events surrounding his brother, Munaf Sudani left the CT side of the Falcons altogether and moved into this organized crime unit that I was talking about earlier. And so he has very successfully kind of rolled up organized crime networks between Najaf and Baghdad that were run primarily by Asab al-Haq, the Shia militia. And in the Sudani family, Harith's kids are all growing up. His oldest daughter got married last summer, as a matter of fact. And, the social cachet of Iraq, I unwittingly helped create a national hero with Harith Sudani's story that I originally published in the New York Times. And so instead of just being a mediocre family from Sadr City, Harith's daughter was the daughter of the hero, Harith Sudani. And so she made a very fine marriage match as a result of the new social status. So life goes on, and we'll have to wait to the next, hopefully we'll have to wait a very long time for the next, big jihadi resurgency because of all the work that they've done in the recent past.
Yeah, well, it's amazing to think life does just go on. But it's great that you told the story in the way that you did, and I urge everyone who is still on the call to go out and buy Spymaster, because it is really a great read. And just having this conversation, there's been so many things that I've wanted to ask Margaret about. So thank you very, very much for tuning in. One day we'll be able to do these in person. Very exciting. But it's been great. And Margaret, thank you so much. If you could hear, I'm sure everyone is clapping their hands in front of their laptops.
Well, if you'd like to learn more about the book, please, you can visit my author site, which is margaretcoker.com. Drop me an email. I'd be happy to carry on the chat further. So thanks again for your time, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.